The mahogany conference table gleamed under the crystal chandelier, but all I could focus on was the piece of paper in my father's trembling hands. $50 million. My inheritance from Grandma Catherine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The check that was supposed to change everything. And then, without a word, he held it over the silver ashtray and set it on fire. The flames danced across the numbers, consuming what should have been my future. My mother watched with cold satisfaction as the ashes fell. But here's the thing they didn't know. What they just burned wasn't the real check. It was a photocopy. And as I sat there smiling, watching their faces filled with vindictive triumph, I realized this family war was just beginning. My name is Victoria Chen, and up until 3 weeks ago, I thought I knew exactly who my parents were. Distinguished lawyers in San Francisco, pillars of the community, the kind of people who threw charity galas and had their photos in society magazines. I was their only daughter, 28 years old, working as a junior partner at a competing firm downtown. We had what most people would call a complicated but loving relationship. I respected them, even if I didn't always agree with their methods. Grandma Catherine had been the glue that held our fractured family together. She was my father's mother, a woman who had built a small tech startup in the 70s and sold it for an astronomical sum before anyone knew what venture capital meant. She was brilliant, fierce, and the only person who ever made my parents seem small in comparison. When she passed away last month, I grieved not just for her, but for the loss of the one person who truly understood me. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing case files in my office overlooking the bay. My father's voice was unusually formal, the way it got when he was delivering news he thought I wouldn't like. "Victoria, we need you at Henderson & Associates tomorrow at 2. It's for your grandmother's will reading." I had expected this, of course, but something in his tone made my stomach tighten. There was an edge there, a careful control that I'd heard before when he was preparing for a particularly brutal cross-examination. I arrived at the law office 15 minutes early, wearing my best navy suit and the pearl necklace Grandma Catherine had given me for my law school graduation. The building was one of those old San Francisco establishments, all dark wood and leather-bound books. The kind of place where deals worth millions were made with handshakes and where secrets were buried deeper than the city's foundations. My parents were already seated when I walked into the conference room, their faces masks of polite expectation. My mother, Elena, looked impeccable as always in her black Chanel suit, her silver hair pulled back in a perfect chignon. My father, Richard, sat ramrod straight in his chair, his hands folded on the table like he was presiding over a board meeting rather than mourning his mother. They barely acknowledged me as I took my seat across from them. Mr. Henderson was Grandma Catherine's longtime attorney, a man in his 70s, with kind eyes and weathered hands, that had seen decades of family drama play out in rooms just like this one. He cleared his throat and began reading from the thick document before him, his voice steady and professional. Most of the will was exactly what I'd expected. Small bequests to charities, gifts to longtime employees, her art collection divided between various museums. Then came the part that changed everything. To my beloved granddaughter Victoria Elena Chen, I leave the sum of $50 million to be held in trust until her 30th birthday, at which time the full amount will be transferred to her control. This bequest comes with one condition. Victoria must remain independent of her parents' financial support and influence for a period of no less than 2 years following my death. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. If this condition is not met, the inheritance will be donated in full to the American Civil Liberties Union. The silence in the room was deafening. I stared at Mr. Henderson, certain I had misheard. $50 million. The number seemed to float in the air like smoke, impossible and surreal. I glanced at my parents, expecting to see surprise, maybe even joy that their daughter had been so generously provided for. Instead, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Rage. Pure, undiluted rage flickering behind my mother's carefully composed expression. My father's jaw was clenched so tight, I could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. Mr. Henderson continued reading, but I barely heard the rest. Something about investments, trustees, annual allowances. My mind was spinning, trying to process not just the magnitude of the inheritance, but my parents' reaction to it. This should have been a moment of celebration, of gratitude, for my grandmother's incredible generosity. Instead, the air in the room felt toxic, charged with an anger I didn't understand. When Mr. Henderson finished reading, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope. "This is for you, Victoria. Your grandmother asked me to give this to you personally." His eyes met mine with something that looked almost like warning. She was very specific about the timing. I took the envelope with trembling fingers, aware that my parents were watching my every move like hawks circling prey. The paper was thick, expensive, with my name written in Grandma Catherine's familiar handwriting across the front. I started to open it, but my father's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Not here." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. "We need to discuss this as a family. Privately." Something in his tone made me pause. This was the voice he used in courtrooms when he was about to destroy a witness. Controlled and dangerous. I looked at Mr. Henderson, who was watching the exchange with obvious discomfort. Without a word, I slipped the envelope into my purse and stood to follow my parents out of the office. The ride home was silent except for the hum of the Mercedes engine and the distant sound of San Francisco traffic. I sat in the back seat, my mind reeling with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answers to. $50 million. Independent of her parents' financial support and influence. The condition felt oddly specific, as if Grandma Catherine had known something I didn't. We arrived at my childhood home in Pacific Heights, the Victorian mansion that had been in our family for 3 generations. The house that had always felt like a sanctuary now seemed different somehow, its shadows deeper and more threatening. My parents led me into my father's study, a room I'd always associated with serious conversations and disappointed lectures. My mother poured herself a glass of wine from the bar cart, her movements sharp and agitated. My father stood behind his desk like a general preparing for battle. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Victoria, I want you to understand something. Your grandmother was not in her right mind these last few years. $50 million is an obscene amount of money to leave to someone your age. It's irresponsible and, frankly, dangerous." I found my voice, though it came out smaller than I intended. "Dangerous how?" My mother set down her wine glass with more force than necessary. "You have no idea how to handle that kind of wealth. You'll be targeted by every fortune hunter and con artist on the West Coast. You'll make terrible investments, probably end up broke within a decade." "But I'm a lawyer," I protested. "I understand contracts and finances. I'm not some naive college student." My father's laugh was bitter. "You're a junior partner at a mid-tier firm. That doesn't qualify you to manage a fortune of this magnitude. No, I think the best thing would be for you to sign the inheritance over to us. We can invest it properly, make sure it's protected. You'll still benefit from it, of course, but in a more structured, responsible way." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sign it over to them. Just like that. The generous gift my grandmother had left specifically to me, they wanted me to hand over, without question. I thought of the condition in the will, the requirement that I remain independent of their financial support and influence. Had Grandma Catherine somehow known this moment would come? "I need time to think about this," I said carefully. My mother's eyes flashed. "There's nothing to think about, Victoria. We're your parents. We know what's best for you." But I was already standing, my purse clutched tight in my hands. "I'll call you tomorrow. I need to process all of this." I was halfway to the door when my father's voice stopped me cold. "Victoria, if you walk out that door right now, if you even think about keeping that money against our wishes, you'll regret it. We know things about your grandmother's finances that you don't, things that could make this inheritance disappear entirely." I turned back to face them, seeing my parents clearly for perhaps the first time in my life. The love I'd always believed was unconditional now seemed conditional indeed, dependent on my compliance with their will. The respect I'd felt for their success and intelligence was cracking, revealing something ugly underneath. "Is that a threat?" I asked quietly. "It's a promise," my mother replied. I left without another word, driving through the foggy San Francisco streets to my own apartment in Soma, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Once inside my small but comfortable space, I finally allowed myself to open Grandma Catherine's letter. The paper rustled as I unfolded it, and her voice seemed to speak to me from beyond the grave. "My dearest Victoria, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have just learned about your inheritance. I imagine your parents are not pleased. I hope you will forgive an old woman's meddling, but I have watched your mother and father for many years, and I have seen how they operate. They believe that love means control, that protection means possession. I left you this money not just because you deserve it, but because I knew they would try to take it from you. The condition about independence is not arbitrary, darling. It's a test. Not of your financial responsibility, but of your strength. I believe you have more of both than they have ever given you credit for. There are things about your parents that you don't know, things I discovered too late to warn you properly. Be careful, my dear one. Trust your instincts. And remember that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest. The real check is in Safety Deposit Box 847 at First National Bank downtown. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my jewelry box, which I left to you in the will. What they will show you tomorrow is a copy. Let them burn it. Let them think they've won. And then, my darling granddaughter, show them what Catherine Chen's blood really means. All my love, Grandma Catherine. P.S. Mr. Henderson knows nothing about this. Trust only yourself. I read the letter 3 times before the full implication hit me. My grandmother had anticipated everything. She'd known my parents would try to manipulate me, threaten me, maybe even try to destroy the inheritance entirely. The check they would undoubtedly demand to see, the one they might try to take from me, was worthless. A decoy. The real $50 million was waiting for me in a safety deposit box they didn't even know existed. But more than that, Grandma Catherine had hinted at secrets, things about my parents that I didn't know, things she'd discovered too late. The phrase echoed in my mind as I sat in my darkened apartment, the city lights twinkling beyond my windows like fallen stars. What had she found out? And why had she felt the need to warn me about the people who had raised me? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and staring at my grandmother's letter, trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't fully understand. Every conversation I'd ever had with my parents took on new significance. Every time they'd dismissed my opinions, overruled my decisions, or made me feel like I wasn't capable of managing my own life, I'd always attributed it to typical parental concern, maybe a touch of old-fashioned protectiveness. Now I wondered if it had been something else entirely. Control. The need to keep me dependent, manageable, under their influence. The inheritance conditions suddenly made perfect sense. Grandma Catherine hadn't just been ensuring my financial independence. She'd been giving me the tools to break free from a dynamic I'd never even realized I was trapped in. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove to Pacific Heights. My parents' house looked different in the bright California sunshine, less imposing but somehow more artificial, like a movie set designed to project success and stability. I let myself in with my key, calling out to make sure no one was home. The silence that greeted me confirmed they were both at their respective offices, no doubt planning their next move in what they probably saw as a battle for control of my inheritance. I went straight to my grandmother's old room, the one my parents had left virtually untouched since her death 3 months ago. Her jewelry box sat on the antique dresser, an ornate Victorian piece that had been her mother's before her. My hands were shaking as I carefully lifted it and felt along the bottom of the bottom drawer. My fingers found the small metal key, taped exactly where Grandma Catherine had said it would be. The key was warm in my palm as I drove downtown to First National Bank, my heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and terror. Safety Deposit Box 847 was in the vault's depths, accessible only with both the key and proper identification. The bank employee, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, led me through the security procedures with professional efficiency. When the metal box opened, I gasped audibly. Inside was a single piece of paper, but I recognized it immediately. A cashier's check made out to Victoria Chen in the amount of $50 million, signed by the president of First National Bank, and bearing all the proper seals and watermarks. The real check. The one that would change my life forever. But beneath it was something else. A manila folder marked with my name in Grandma Catherine's handwriting. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold. Financial records, bank statements, legal correspondence. Evidence of a pattern of behavior that went back years. My parents had been systematically draining Grandma Catherine's accounts. Not stealing, exactly, but manipulating. Convincing her to make loans they never repaid, investments in their friends' businesses that conveniently failed, legal fees for services that may or may not have been rendered. Over the past 5 years, they had extracted nearly $10 million from her various accounts through a web of transactions so complex it would have taken a forensic accountant to untangle them. But Grandma Catherine had been smarter than they'd given her credit for. She'd hired that forensic accountant. The folder contained a complete audit of every questionable transaction, every suspicious transfer, every loan that had been forgiven under mysterious circumstances. She'd documented everything, building a case that would have destroyed my parents' legal careers and probably landed them in prison. The final document in the folder was a letter addressed to the California State Bar Association, detailing my parents' financial misconduct and recommending a full investigation. It was dated just 1 week before Grandma Catherine's death and marked, quote, "to be sent upon my demise unless certain conditions are met." Those conditions were outlined in a separate document. Full restitution of all funds, a written apology, and a promise to never interfere with Victoria's inheritance or life choices. Grandma Catherine had been blackmailing them, keeping them in line with the threat of exposure and ruin. And now she was dead. The letter had never been sent, and they thought they were free to resume their manipulative behavior with me. I sat in the bank's parking garage for 20 minutes, staring at the evidence of my parents' greed and corruption. Everything I'd believed about them, every ounce of respect and love I'd felt, was crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. They weren't the honorable lawyers I'd looked up to my entire life. They were thieves who had stolen from an elderly woman and were now trying to steal from me. The rage that filled me was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It started as a burning in my chest and spread through my entire body until my hands were shaking and my vision was blurred with tears of fury. But beneath the anger was something else. A cold, calculating determination that I recognized with surprise. It was the same feeling I got in court when I knew I had a winning case, when all the pieces of evidence aligned perfectly and I could see exactly how to destroy my opponent's argument. My parents thought they were the smart ones, the experienced ones, the ones who knew how to manipulate and control. They had underestimated their daughter, just as they had underestimated their victim. But I was Catherine Chen's granddaughter, and I had inherited more than just her money. I had inherited her intelligence, her strategic mind, and her absolute refusal to be anyone's victim. I drove home and spent the rest of the day planning. If my parents wanted to play games, I would play along. I would let them think they had the upper hand right up until the moment I destroyed them completely. The real check went into my own safety deposit box at a different bank, along with copies of all the evidence Grandma Catherine had gathered. The original documents I photographed and uploaded to a secure cloud storage account, then returned to their hiding place in my grandmother's room. That evening, my father called. His voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the underlying tension. "Victoria, your mother and I have done some research into your grandmother's estate. There are some irregularities that concern us. We think it would be best if you brought the check here so we can examine it properly." "Of course," I replied, matching his false calm with my own. "I'll be there tomorrow evening. We can discuss everything then." What he didn't know was that I'd already had a perfect photocopy made of the real check, aged slightly and treated to look authentic. It was indistinguishable from the original, unless you knew exactly what to look for. And tomorrow evening I would hand it over with just the right amount of reluctance, let them examine it to their satisfaction, and watch as they revealed their true intentions. The game was about to begin, and for the first time in my life, I held all the cards. The morning arrived, gray and drizzling, typical San Francisco weather that matched my mood perfectly. I had barely slept, my mind churning through scenarios and possibilities like a computer running endless calculations. The photocopied check sat in my purse, feeling heavier than it should have, while the real $50 million inheritance remained safely locked away in my new safety deposit box across town. I dressed carefully for work that day, choosing a conservative black blazer and matching skirt that made me look younger than my 28 years. If my parents were going to underestimate me, I might as well help them along. The reflection in my bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked tired and uncertain, exactly the image I wanted to project when I arrived at their house that evening. My law office felt different that morning, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The partners' names on the letterhead, the impressive diplomas on the walls, the leather-bound legal volumes that lined every available surface. For years, this world had represented everything I aspired to become. Now I wondered how many of these distinguished attorneys were hiding secrets as dark as my parents. How many had built their careers on manipulation and theft rather than genuine skill and integrity? My assistant, Maria, knocked on my door around 10:30 with a concerned expression. "Miss Chen, your mother called 3 times this morning. She says it's urgent family business and you're not answering your cell phone." I had turned off my phone deliberately, needing space to think without their constant pressure. "Tell her I'm in depositions all day and will call tonight," I instructed. Maria nodded and left, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes. In the 3 years she'd worked for me, my parents had never called the office with such persistence. The rest of the morning crawled by as I tried to focus on case files and client meetings, but my concentration was shattered. Every few minutes, my mind would drift back to the documents hidden in my grandmother's room, the evidence of years of systematic theft and manipulation. I kept thinking about Grandma Catherine in her final months, probably knowing what they had done to her but feeling trapped by family loyalty and the fear of destroying her son's career. At lunch, I drove to a quiet cafe in the Mission District, far from my usual haunts where I might run into colleagues or family friends. I needed to call someone I could trust, someone outside the toxic web my parents had woven around our family. The only person who came to mind was my college roommate, Jessica Martinez, who now worked as an investigative journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle. Jessica answered on the second ring, her voice bright with surprise. "Victoria, I was just thinking about you. How are you holding up after your grandmother's passing?" We chatted briefly about Grandma Catherine and the funeral, but I could hear Jessica's reporter instincts kicking in as I struggled to find the right words to explain my situation. Finally, I decided on a direct approach. "Jess, I need to ask you something hypothetical. If someone discovered that their family members had been financially exploiting an elderly relative, what would be the best way to expose that without destroying their own life in the process?" The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Jessica spoke again, her voice had shifted into professional mode. "Victoria, is this hypothetical situation something you're personally dealing with? Because if it is, you need to be very careful about how you proceed." I found myself telling her everything. The inheritance, my parents' reaction, the documents I'd found, even my plan to use the photocopied check to draw them out. Jessica listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of shock or sympathy. When I finished, she was quiet for several long moments. "Jesus, Victoria, this is bigger than just family drama. If what you're saying is true, your parents could face criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud. But you're right to be cautious. People like your parents, with connections and resources, they don't go down easy. They'll fight dirty, and they'll try to drag you down with them." Her words sent a chill through me but also strengthened my resolve. "What would you do?" I asked. Jessica's response was immediate. "Document everything. Get copies of every piece of evidence you can find. And don't go to tonight's meeting alone. Is there someone you trust who can be there as a witness?" The idea of bringing a witness had never occurred to me, but it made perfect sense. My parents were lawyers, skilled at manipulation and intimidation. Having someone else present would limit their ability to gaslight me or make threats they could later deny. The question was who I could ask for such a favor without having to explain the entire complicated situation. The answer came to me as I was driving back to the office. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was a retired teacher who had known our family for decades. She was sharp, observant, and completely immune to my parents' charm offensive. More importantly, she had always treated me like the granddaughter she never had, offering advice and support whenever I needed it. I called her from my office that afternoon, explaining that I was having a difficult family discussion about my inheritance and would feel more comfortable with a neutral party present. Mrs. Patterson, bless her heart, didn't ask for details. She simply said she would be happy to help and would meet me at my parents' house at 7 o'clock. The afternoon dragged on interminably. I kept checking my watch, amazed at how slowly time could move when you were dreading something. Around 4 o'clock, I received a text from my mother that made my stomach clench with anxiety. Bring all inheritance documents tonight. We've consulted with tax attorneys, and there are serious issues that need immediate attention. The message was clearly designed to sound urgent and official, the kind of communication that would send most people into a panic about legal complications and potential problems. But I recognized it for what it was: psychological manipulation, an attempt to put me on the defensive before I even walked through their door. They wanted me worried and confused, more likely to accept their guidance without question. Instead of responding to the text, I spent the last hour of my workday researching inheritance law and tax implications online. As I'd suspected, there were no immediate issues with my grandmother's bequest. The estate had been properly probated, all taxes had been paid from the estate's assets, and my inheritance was completely legitimate and legal. My parents were lying, trying to create urgency where none existed. I left the office at 5:30 and drove home to change clothes. I wanted to look professional but not intimidating, capable but not threatening. I settled on a navy blue dress with a modest neckline and simple pearl earrings. In the mirror, I looked like exactly what I was supposed to be: a dutiful daughter who respected her parents' judgment and wouldn't dream of challenging their authority. Mrs. Patterson was waiting on her front porch when I arrived home, dressed in her usual elegant style. She was in her 70s but carried herself with the dignity of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms full of rowdy teenagers. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and her blue eyes were sharp with intelligence. "Thank you so much for doing this," I said as we walked to my car. "I know it's unusual, but I really appreciate having you there." "Nonsense, dear. Family discussions about money can get heated, and it's always good to have a level-headed witness present. Your grandmother mentioned to me once that she was worried about how your parents might react to her will. She was a very wise woman." The comment surprised me. I hadn't realized that Grandma Catherine had discussed her concerns with anyone outside the family. "How much did she tell you?" I asked as we drove through the foggy evening streets. Mrs. Patterson was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. She said she'd noticed some irregularities in her finances and was concerned that certain family members might not have her best interests at heart. She never said anything specific, but I got the impression she was gathering evidence about something important. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. It sounded like Grandma Catherine had been more open about her suspicions than I'd realized. The fact that she'd mentioned her concerns to a neighbor suggested she'd been genuinely afraid of what my parents might do after her death. We arrived at my childhood home just as the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. The Victorian mansion looked imposing in the evening gloom, its tall windows glowing with warm light that should have been welcoming but somehow felt ominous instead. I could see my parents' silhouettes moving around in my father's study, no doubt preparing for what they assumed would be an easy victory. Mrs. Patterson and I walked up the front steps together, and I used my key to let us in. The house smelled like my mother's expensive perfume and my father's cigars, familiar scents that had once meant home and safety. Now they seemed cloying, artificial, like the smell of flowers at a funeral. My parents emerged from the study as we entered the foyer, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion when they saw Mrs. Patterson beside me. My mother recovered first, her social smile sliding into place like a mask. "Eleanor, what a lovely surprise. We weren't expecting you tonight." Mrs. Patterson returned the smile with one of her own, equally artificial but somehow more genuine. Victoria asked me to join her for this family discussion. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but she felt it would be helpful to have a neutral party present. I watched my father's face carefully and saw the flash of anger he quickly suppressed. They had planned this conversation assuming they would have complete control over the narrative. The presence of a witness, especially one with Mrs. Patterson's reputation for honesty and integrity, had already disrupted their strategy. "Of course," my father said smoothly. Though I'm not sure why Victoria felt the need for outside intervention in a private family matter. His tone was pleasant enough, but I caught the underlying criticism. He was already trying to make me feel guilty for bringing backup, to paint my caution as a sign of disrespect or paranoia. It was a technique I'd seen him use in court countless times, subtle undermining designed to put his opponent on the defensive. "I thought it would be good to have someone present who could help keep the discussion focused and productive," I replied evenly. "This is an important decision, and I want to make sure we handle it properly." We moved into the study, where my parents had obviously staged the setting for maximum psychological impact. The room was dimly lit, with my father's massive desk positioned so that he would be sitting in authority while I would be in the supplicant's chair across from him. Legal books lined the walls, and my parents' diplomas and awards were prominently displayed, subtle reminders of their expertise and my comparative inexperience. Mrs. Patterson and I took seats in the two chairs facing the desk, while my parents positioned themselves behind it like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. My mother had poured herself another glass of wine, and my father had lit one of his expensive cigars, filling the room with smoke that made my eyes water. Well, my father began without preamble. "Your mother and I have spent considerable time today consulting with tax specialists and estate planning experts about your grandmother's bequest. I'm afraid the situation is more complicated than we initially realized." He reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder filled with official-looking documents. "There are significant tax implications that your grandmother apparently didn't consider when she structured the inheritance. Without proper planning, you could end up owing millions in penalties and interest to the IRS." I felt Mrs. Patterson shift slightly beside me, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. My father was an estate planning attorney with 30 years of experience. If there were tax issues with Grandma Catherine's will, he would have known about them before today. This was theater, designed to frighten me into compliance. "What kind of tax issues?" I asked, trying to sound concerned rather than skeptical. My mother leaned forward, her expression grave with manufactured worry. "The inheritance is structured as a lump sum payment, which puts you in the highest tax bracket immediately. Combined with the penalty for not having proper estimated tax payments set up in advance, you could owe as much as $25 million to the government." The number was clearly chosen for maximum impact, exactly half of the inheritance amount. It was also complete nonsense. Inheritances weren't taxable income to the recipient, and estimated tax payments weren't required on money you hadn't received yet. They were counting on my not knowing the specific details of tax law, assuming I would panic and turn to them for help. "That sounds serious," I said carefully. "What do you recommend?" My father stubbed out his cigar and pulled out another set of documents. "The best solution would be to transfer the inheritance into a family trust that your mother and I would manage. We can structure it to minimize tax liability and ensure the money is invested properly for long-term growth. You would still benefit from the inheritance, of course, but in a more tax-efficient and responsible manner." There it was. The real purpose of this elaborate performance. They wanted me to sign over control of the $50 million to them, just as they had demanded the day before. The fake tax crisis was simply a more sophisticated version of their earlier argument about my supposed inability to handle such a large sum of money. I reached into my purse and withdrew the photocopied check, placing it on the desk between us. "This is the inheritance check. I'd like you to look it over and make sure everything is in order before we discuss any transfers or trust arrangements." My father picked up the check with hands that trembled slightly, whether from excitement or anxiety I couldn't tell. He examined it carefully, holding it up to the light to check the watermarks and security features. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her eyes fixed on the numbers as if she could make them real through sheer force of will. "This appears to be legitimate," my father said after several minutes of scrutiny. "The bank seals and signatures look authentic, and the amount matches what Mr. Henderson told us yesterday." I nodded solemnly, as if I hadn't already known the check would pass their inspection. It was a perfect copy, after all, created from the real check, with the same paper and printing techniques the bank had used. Unless they had access to the bank's verification systems, they would never know the difference. "So what happens next?" I asked. "If I sign the trust documents, what exactly would that involve?" My mother pulled out a thick stack of legal papers that they had obviously prepared in advance. "It's quite straightforward, really. You would sign over power of attorney for all matters related to the inheritance, and we would establish a trust fund with ourselves as trustees. You would receive a monthly allowance from the trust, and we would handle all the investments and tax planning." I flipped through the documents, noting that the monthly allowance they had proposed was laughably small compared to the inheritance amount. They were essentially asking me to sign away control of $50 million in exchange for what amounted to a modest salary. It was insulting in its transparency, yet they were presenting it as if they were doing me an enormous favor. Mrs. Patterson spoke up for the first time since we'd entered the study. "May I ask what qualifications you have for managing an investment portfolio of this size? I don't mean any disrespect, but $50 million is a substantial sum that requires specialized expertise." My father's smile grew tight around the edges. "We've been managing family investments for decades, Eleanor. I think our track record speaks for itself." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't intimidated by his dismissive tone. "I'm sure you're very competent attorneys, but investment management is a different skill set entirely. Has Victoria considered consulting with professional financial advisors who specialize in large portfolio management?" The question hung in the air like smoke from my father's cigar, and I watched my parents' faces carefully. They were clearly annoyed by Mrs. Patterson's interference, but they couldn't openly challenge her without appearing unreasonable. She was asking exactly the right questions, the ones any sensible person would ask before signing over control of such a massive inheritance. "I think that's an excellent suggestion," I said, seizing on Mrs. Patterson's opening. "Maybe I should talk to some financial planning firms before making any decisions about trust arrangements. I want to make sure I'm getting the best possible advice." My mother's wine glass clinked sharply against the desk as she set it down with unnecessary force. "Victoria, you're making this much more complicated than it needs to be. We're your parents. We have your best interests at heart. Do you really think some stranger at an investment firm is going to care about you the way we do?" Her voice had taken on the martyred tone she always used when she felt her authority was being questioned. It was a familiar manipulation tactic designed to make me feel guilty for not trusting them completely. But this time, instead of the usual pang of shame, I felt only cold anger. "I understand that you want to help," I replied carefully. "But this is a life-changing amount of money, and I think Grandma Catherine would have wanted me to be thorough in my decision-making process." The mention of my grandmother's name caused a visible reaction in both my parents. My father's jaw tightened, and my mother's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, a nervous gesture I'd noticed whenever she felt cornered. It was clear that invoking Grandma Catherine's wishes made them uncomfortable, though I wasn't yet sure why. "Your grandmother wasn't thinking clearly in her final years," my father said dismissively. "The inheritance itself proves that. No rational person leaves that kind of money to someone so young and inexperienced." His words stung, even though I knew they were designed to undermine my confidence. But they also revealed something important about his mindset. In his view, I was inherently incapable of handling adult responsibilities, regardless of my education, professional experience, or demonstrated competence. The inheritance wasn't a gift from a loving grandmother who believed in my potential. It was a mistake made by a confused old woman who didn't know better. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat delicately. "I spent quite a bit of time with Catherine in her final months, and I can assure you that her mind was completely sharp. She was very deliberate about her estate planning, and spoke often about wanting to ensure Victoria's independence and security." My mother's laugh had an edge to it that made me wince. "Independence? Victoria has always been independent. We've never tried to control her life or her decisions." The statement was so blatantly false that I almost laughed out loud. My entire life had been a series of decisions made by committee, with my parents wielding veto power over everything from my college choices to my career path to my romantic relationships. They had convinced me it was loving guidance, but now I could see it for what it really was: systematic control, designed to keep me dependent on their approval and support. "I think what Mrs. Patterson means," I said slowly, "is that Grandma Catherine wanted me to have the financial resources to make my own choices, without having to worry about anyone else's opinions or interference." The words were carefully chosen, and I watched my parents' faces as they landed. My father's expression darkened, and I could see him processing the implication that he and my mother might be considered interfering parties. My mother's social mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of pure rage before she composed herself again. "Well," my father said stiffly, "I suppose if you're determined to ignore our advice and expertise, there's nothing we can do to stop you. But don't come crying to us when you've made a mess of things and lost everything." His tone was cold and final, the voice he used to dismiss opposing counsel when he thought their arguments were beneath contempt. It was the same tone he'd used throughout my childhood whenever I dared to express an opinion that differed from his own. But this time, instead of backing down and apologizing, I felt something harden inside me. "I appreciate your concern," I said, standing up and taking the photocopied check from his desk. "But I think it would be best if I took some time to consider all my options before making any major decisions." Mrs. Patterson rose beside me, her presence a comforting reminder that I wasn't facing this confrontation alone. We moved toward the door of the study, but my mother's voice stopped us before we could leave. "Victoria, wait. There's something else we need to discuss." "Something about your grandmother that you should know," I turned back, seeing something in her expression that made my stomach clench with dread. She was wearing the same look she'd had the day. She'd told me our family dog had been hit by a car, a mixture of false sympathy and barely concealed satisfaction. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. My father joined my mother behind the desk, and together they looked like a tribunal preparing to deliver judgment. "Your grandmother wasn't the saint you think she was, Victoria. There are things about her business dealings, about how she acquired her wealth, that would shock you." He paused dramatically, clearly enjoying my discomfort. "Some of the money she left you came from very questionable sources. If certain information came to light, the entire inheritance could be subject to government seizure under asset forfeiture laws." The threat was delivered with the casual precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to cut deep while appearing to offer helpful information. They were essentially claiming that my grandmother had been involved in criminal activity, and that accepting the inheritance could make me an accessory after the fact. But I had read every document in Grandma Catherine's folder, including detailed financial records going back decades. Her wealth had come from legitimate business investments and the sale of her technology company to IBM in the early 80s. There was nothing questionable or illegal about any of it. My parents were lying again, hoping to frighten me into surrendering the inheritance before I could discover the truth about their own criminal behavior. "That's a very serious accusation," Mrs. Patterson said before I could respond. "Do you have evidence to support these claims?" My father's smile was thin and predatory. "Let's just say that certain government agencies have been asking questions about some of Catherine's old business associates. It would be very unfortunate if Victoria became caught up in that investigation." The threat was clear enough. If I didn't cooperate with their demands, they would somehow involve me in a fabricated criminal investigation. They were prepared to destroy my reputation and possibly my freedom to get control of the inheritance money. The realization hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless with shock and betrayal. These were the people who had raised me, who had claimed to love me unconditionally, who had taught me the importance of honesty and integrity. And they were threatening to frame me for crimes I hadn't committed in order to steal money that legally belonged to me. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming, like discovering that everything I'd believed about gravity or mathematics was wrong. "I think we should go," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, her hand touching my elbow in a gesture of support. "This conversation has taken a very unfortunate turn." I nodded, not trusting my voice to remain steady. My parents watched us leave with expressions of cold satisfaction, clearly believing they had successfully intimidated me into submission. They had no idea that their threats had actually strengthened my resolve. confirming everything Grandma Catherine had warned me about in her letter. Mrs. Patterson and I walked to my car in silence, the cool San Francisco evening air a welcome relief after the oppressive atmosphere of my father's study. I was shaking as I fumbled with the car keys, my hands trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and rage. "Victoria, dear," Mrs. Patterson said gently, as we drove away from the house. "I want you to know that nothing your parents said tonight changes my opinion of your grandmother. Catherine Chen was one of the most honest and principled people I've ever known. Whatever they're claiming about her business dealings, I can guarantee it's not true." Her words were like a lifeline in the chaos of my emotions. I had begun to doubt everything, wondering if maybe there were secrets about Grandma Catherine that I didn't know. But Mrs. Patterson had known her for over 20 years, had seen her character up close, and her testimony carried more weight than all my parents' vague accusations. "Thank you," I managed to say. I needed to hear that. "What are you going to do now?" she asked as I pulled into our shared driveway. I sat in the car for a moment, staring at my apartment building and thinking about the choice that lay before me. I could back down, sign over the inheritance, and go back to being the dutiful daughter who never questioned her parents' authority. It would be easier, safer, and would preserve the illusion of family harmony that had defined my entire life. Or I could fight. I could use the evidence Grandma Catherine had left me to expose my parents' crimes and protect the inheritance she had intended for me. It would mean declaring war on the people who had raised me, destroying any hope of reconciliation, and facing whatever retaliation they might devise. But as I thought about my grandmother's letter, about her warning to trust my instincts and remember what Catherine Chen's blood really meant, the answer became clear. "I'm going to show them what their daughter is really capable of," I said finally. "They want to play games with threats and manipulation? Fine. But they have no idea who they're dealing with." Mrs. Patterson smiled, and in the dim light of the car's interior, she looked remarkably like my grandmother. "I think Catherine would be very proud of you, dear. She always said you had more strength than anyone gave you credit for." As I walked up to my apartment that night, the photocopied check still in my purse, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my grandmother's death. Hope. Not just for the money, though that would certainly change my life in profound ways. But hope that I could finally break free from the web of control and manipulation that had defined my relationship with my parents for 28 years. The real check was still safely locked away, waiting for me to claim it when the time was right. But more importantly, I now had all the ammunition I needed to fight back against the people who thought they could intimidate and control me with empty threats and emotional manipulation. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin, and for the first time in my life, I was looking forward to proving just how wrong they were about me. The morning sun filtered through my apartment windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sleep had been elusive, my mind racing through scenarios and strategies like a chess player analyzing possible moves. The photocopied check lay beside my laptop, a prop in the elaborate performance I was about to orchestrate. I had spent the early hours researching my parents' law firm, diving deep into public records and client databases that my legal training had taught me how to access. What I found painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Over the past 5 years, they had represented an unusually high number of elderly clients in estate planning matters, many of whom had made substantial changes to their wills shortly before their deaths. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother, the tone dripping with false sweetness. "Darling, I hope you've had time to reconsider our discussion last night. Your father and I are prepared to meet with our accountant this afternoon to begin setting up the trust arrangement. Please let us know when you can bring the check by the office." The message confirmed what I had suspected. They weren't going to wait for me to make a decision. They were moving forward with their plan, assuming that their threats and intimidation tactics had been successful. In their minds, I was already beaten, ready to hand over my inheritance in exchange for their continued approval and protection from the fictional legal troubles they had conjured. I crafted my response carefully, injecting just the right note of reluctant compliance. I've been thinking about what you said regarding the tax implications. Perhaps we should meet at your office this afternoon so I can see exactly what documents need to be signed. Would 3 o'clock work? Her reply came within minutes. Perfect. We'll have everything ready for you. I'm so glad you're being sensible about this. Sensible. The word stung because I knew exactly what she meant. In their vocabulary, being sensible meant accepting their authority without question, surrendering my autonomy in exchange for their guidance and protection. It meant remaining the obedient daughter who never challenged their decisions or dared to think she knew better than her parents. But as I prepared for the afternoon's meeting, I felt anything but sensible. I felt dangerous, charged with the kind of focused energy that came from finally understanding the true nature of the game being played around me. They expected submission, but they were going to get something entirely different. I arrived at my parents' law office 10 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained the photocopied check, along with several legitimate-looking documents I had created to support my performance. The building was a gleaming tower in the heart of San Francisco's financial district, all glass and steel and expensive marble that spoke of success and power. Chen and Associates occupied the entire 32nd floor, with views that stretched across the bay to the distant hills of Marin County. The receptionist, a polished young woman who probably made more in a year than most people saw in 5, greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that wealthy clients expected. "Ms. Chen, your parents are waiting for you in the main conference room. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" I declined, and followed her down a hallway lined with oil paintings and awards, past offices where junior associates bent over documents, and senior partners conducted meetings behind closed doors. The conference room was impressive, designed to intimidate opposing counsel and impress potential clients. A massive mahogany table dominated the space, surrounded by leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars. My parents were already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 people I didn't recognize. My father stood as I entered, his smile the practiced expression of a man who had spent decades manipulating juries and witnesses. "Victoria, thank you for coming. I'd like you to meet Harold Whitman, our firm's senior accountant, and Patricia Valdez, who specializes in estate tax planning." The introduction of outside experts was clearly meant to lend credibility to their fabricated tax crisis, giving weight to their claims about the inheritance's supposed legal complications. I shook hands with both strangers, noting the expensive suits and confident demeanor that marked them as members of my parents' professional circle. Harold Whitman was a thin man in his 60s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors, poring over financial documents. His handshake was firm but brief, and his eyes held the calculating look of someone who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. Patricia Valdez was younger, perhaps 45, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of sharp intelligence that made her a formidable opponent in any negotiation. We settled around the conference table, and my father wasted no time getting to the point. "Victoria, Harold and Patricia have reviewed your grandmother's estate documents, and I'm afraid their analysis confirms our worst fears about the tax implications." Harold opened a thick folder and spread several documents across the table, pointing to highlighted sections with the tip of his pen. "The inheritance structure creates what we call a tax bomb scenario. Because the full $50 million is being transferred in a single year, it triggers the highest federal tax rates along with California's inheritance penalties." I leaned forward to examine the documents, noting that they appeared to be legitimate tax codes and IRS regulations. But as I read more carefully, I realized they were discussing corporate tax law rather than inheritance tax, cleverly presented in a way that would confuse someone without specialized knowledge. They were counting on my not knowing enough about tax law to spot the deception. Patricia took over the presentation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years navigating complex financial regulations. "Without proper planning, you could be looking at a total tax liability of $38 million. That would leave you with only $12 million from your grandmother's bequest, and even that amount would be subject to annual wealth taxes that could drain it within a decade." The numbers were designed to shock and frighten, creating a sense of urgency that would push me toward accepting their proposed solution. But I had spent enough time researching inheritance law to know that their claims were nonsense. Inherited assets weren't subject to income tax, and California had eliminated its inheritance tax decades ago. They were essentially creating a fictional crisis to justify their theft. My mother joined the presentation with documents outlining their proposed trust arrangement. Fortunately, we can structure a family trust that would eliminate almost all of these tax liabilities. The inheritance would be transferred into the trust, with your father and me serving as co-trustees, and you would receive distributions according to a predetermined schedule. I examined the trust documents, noting that the predetermined schedule would give me access to only a tiny fraction of the inheritance each year, while granting my parents broad discretionary power over investments and distributions. It was essentially a sophisticated form of theft, legally structured to transfer control of my grandmother's money to them, while providing me with just enough income to prevent me from complaining too loudly. This all sounds very complicated, I said carefully, playing the role of the overwhelmed daughter who was grateful for her parents' expertise. But I have to ask why Grandma Catherine didn't set up these arrangements herself, if the tax issues are so severe. My father's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a tell I remembered from childhood, whenever he was preparing to deliver a lie that he particularly disliked having to tell. Your grandmother was brilliant in her business dealings, but estate tax planning wasn't her area of expertise. She relied on outdated advice from attorneys who didn't fully understand the current regulatory environment. The explanation was smooth and plausible, exactly the kind of reasonable-sounding nonsense that had convinced me to accept their guidance for most of my life. But now I could see it for what it was. A carefully crafted deception designed to undermine my confidence in my grandmother's judgment, while positioning themselves as the only people qualified to protect me from disaster. Harold leaned forward with what appeared to be genuine concern. Ms. Chen, I understand this is overwhelming, but we really need to act quickly. The IRS has become much more aggressive about pursuing inheritance tax violations, and delays could result in additional penalties that would make the situation even worse. The artificial urgency was another manipulation tactic designed to prevent me from seeking independent advice or taking time to research their claims. They wanted me to sign the documents immediately, before I had a chance to discover that their entire presentation was built on lies and fabricated regulations. I nodded thoughtfully, as if weighing the serious implications of their warnings. You're right, this is a lot to process. But before I sign anything, I'd like to understand exactly how the trust would work. For instance, what happens if I disagree with an investment decision or want to access more money than the predetermined schedule allows? Patricia's smile became slightly strained, though she maintained her professional demeanor. The trust documents include provisions for extraordinary circumstances, but in general, the trustees would have broad discretionary authority to make decisions in the beneficiary's best interest. In other words, I would have no real control over my own inheritance. My parents would make all the decisions, and I would be dependent on their goodwill for access to money that legally belonged to me. It was the ultimate expression of their need to control every aspect of my life, disguised as financial planning and tax optimization. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over mine in a gesture that might have looked maternal to an outside observer. Sweetheart, I know this isn't what you expected when you inherited this money, but your father and I have been managing complex financial matters for decades. We know how to protect wealth and make it grow. You have to trust us. The word trust hung in the air between us, loaded with 30 years of conditioning and emotional manipulation. She was asking me to trust the same people who had systematically stolen from my grandmother, who had threatened to frame me for fictional crimes, who were at this very moment lying to my face about tax laws and legal obligations. I looked around the conference room at the four faces watching me expectantly, waiting for me to capitulate and sign away my future. My parents wore expressions of patient concern, while their hired experts maintained the neutral professionalism that expensive consultants cultivated like a second skin. They all assumed they knew exactly how this meeting would end. You know what, I said finally, reaching into my portfolio and withdrawing the photocopied check. You're absolutely right. I should trust the people who love me and want what's best for me. I placed the check on the conference table where everyone could see it clearly. The room fell silent, as all four pairs of eyes fixed on the document that represented $50 million and the power that came with it. I could practically feel the greed radiating from my parents as they stared at the numbers that they believed would soon be under their control. Before we proceed with signing the trust documents, though, I think it would be appropriate to have a small ceremony to mark this important transition. After all, this inheritance represents Grandma Catherine's final gift to our family, and I want to honor her memory properly. My father looked puzzled but pleased by what appeared to be a sentimental gesture. "That's a lovely idea, Victoria. What did you have in mind?" I stood up and walked to the small fireplace that occupied one corner of the conference room, a decorative feature that added warmth and elegance to the space, but was rarely used for its intended purpose. "I think we should burn this check before signing the trust documents. It's symbolic, you know? Letting go of individual ownership in favor of family unity and shared responsibility." The suggestion seemed to catch everyone off guard. Harold and Patricia exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure whether this was a normal part of wealthy family dynamics or evidence that their client's daughter was having some kind of emotional breakdown. My parents, however, looked absolutely delighted by the proposal. My mother clapped her hands together softly. "What a beautiful way to honor your grandmother's wishes. She always valued family unity above everything else." The lie rolled off her tongue so smoothly that I almost admired her skill. Grandma Catherine had actually despised my parents' controlling behavior and had spent her final years trying to protect me from their influence. But my mother's ability to rewrite history to suit her current needs was truly impressive in its shamelessness. My father was already moving toward the fireplace, his eagerness barely contained behind a mask of solemn ceremony. "I think we have matches in the desk drawer. This is really quite touching, Victoria. Your grandmother would be so proud of your maturity and wisdom." I retrieved a book of matches from the desk and rejoined the group around the fireplace. The conference room suddenly felt charged with electricity, as if we were all participating in some ancient ritual whose true meaning had been lost to time. In a way, I suppose we were. This was a sacrifice, a burning away of the old order to make room for something new. "Are you sure about this, dear?" my mother asked, though her eyes were fixed on the check with undisguised hunger. "Once we burn it, there's no going back." "I'm absolutely certain," I replied, striking a match and holding it close to the corner of the photocopied check. "This represents the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I want all of you to witness this moment." The match flame caught the edge of the paper, and fire began to spread across the printed numbers and official-looking seals. $50 million curled and blackened as the flames consumed the document that my parents believed represented their ultimate victory over my independence and autonomy. My father watched with barely concealed satisfaction as the last fragments of the check crumbled into ash. "Well done, Victoria. This is the beginning of a new level of trust and cooperation in our family." My mother nodded approvingly, already reaching for the trust documents. "Now that we've taken care of the symbolic ceremony, we should move quickly to establish the legal framework. Harold, do you have the signature pages ready?" But I remained standing by the fireplace, staring down at the ashes, with a small smile playing at the corners of my mouth. The burned paper represented so much more than they realized. It was the destruction of their illusions about my gullibility and compliance. It was the end of their assumption that they could manipulate me indefinitely through lies and emotional blackmail. "Is something wrong, Victoria?" Patricia asked, apparently noticing that I hadn't moved to sign the trust documents. I turned back to face the group, and something in my expression must have changed because my father's triumphant smile began to fade. "Not wrong, exactly. But there is something I should probably mention before we proceed with the trust arrangements." I walked back to the conference table and placed my hands flat on its polished surface, looking directly into my parents' eyes. What we just burned wasn't actually the real inheritance check. It was a photocopy. The real $50 million is safely locked away in a place where none of you will ever be able to touch it. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. Harold and Patricia looked confused, clearly trying to process what they had just heard. But my parents' faces went through a fascinating progression of emotions: shock, disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that was more frightening than their anger. My mother was the first to recover her composure. "I don't understand. Why would you make a copy of the check? And where is the original? Her voice was carefully controlled, but I could see the fury burning behind her eyes. She was realizing that their elaborate performance had been wasted, that all their lies about tax implications and legal complications had been exposed as the manipulative theater they really were. My father stood up slowly, his hands braced against the table. Victoria, this isn't funny. If you're playing some kind of game with us, I suggest you stop right now. But I was just getting started. The game, as you call it, has been going on for years, hasn't it? All those elderly clients who changed their wills right before they died. All those estate planning fees and investment management charges that somehow found their way into your personal accounts. Did you really think Grandma Catherine didn't notice what you were doing to her? The color drained from both my parents' faces as they realized how much I knew about their criminal activities. Harold and Patricia were beginning to look distinctly uncomfortable, probably wondering whether they should leave before this family confrontation turned into something that might require them to testify in court. Patricia cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should postpone this meeting until you've had a chance to resolve these family issues privately. She was already gathering her documents, clearly eager to distance herself from what was rapidly becoming a very messy situation. Harold was following her lead, closing his folder and preparing to make a hasty exit. Neither of them wanted to be associated with whatever was about to happen in this conference room. My father's mask of paternal concern finally slipped completely, revealing the ruthless attorney underneath. You have no idea what you're messing with, Victoria. There are consequences for crossing family, consequences you can't even imagine. The threat was delivered with the cold precision of someone who had spent decades intimidating opponents into submission. But instead of the fear he expected to see, my response was a laugh that surprised even me with its genuine amusement. Consequences? Like the consequences Grandma Catherine faced when she discovered you'd been stealing from her for years? Like the consequences I would have faced if I'd been naive enough to sign your trust documents and let you steal my inheritance too? My mother's composure cracked completely. How dare you accuse us of stealing? Everything we did was to protect this family's financial interests. Your grandmother was old and confused, making decisions that could have destroyed everything we've worked to build. There it was. The justification that had probably allowed them to sleep at night while they systematically drained my grandmother's accounts. In their minds, they weren't thieves. They were protectors, safeguarding family assets from an elderly woman who was no longer competent to manage her own affairs. Protected her right into an early grave, you mean? I replied. Did you think I wouldn't find the insurance policies you took out on her life? The ones with the convenient accident clauses that would have paid out double if she died in the car crash you arranged? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from the burned check, and for a moment nobody spoke. My parents stared at me with expressions of shock and horror, but whether they were horrified by my knowledge or by the fact that I was willing to voice such suspicions, I couldn't tell. My father recovered first, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper he used when he was preparing to destroy someone completely. You're going to regret this conversation, Victoria. I promise you that. We've been patient with your childish rebellion, but if you want to declare war on your own family, we're prepared to fight back. The promise of retaliation should have terrified me. These were powerful people with connections throughout the legal and financial communities of San Francisco. They had the resources and expertise to make my life very difficult if they chose to do so. But instead of fear, I felt only a deep sense of liberation. For the first time in my life, I was seeing my parents clearly, without the filter of childhood conditioning and emotional manipulation. They weren't the wise, protective figures I had always believed them to be. They were predators who had spent years perfecting their techniques for exploitation and control. And now that I had broken free from their influence, they were revealing their true nature. I picked up my portfolio and headed toward the conference room door, pausing only to deliver my final words. The war you're talking about? It started the moment you decided to steal from your own family. But here's the thing you haven't figured out yet. Grandma Catherine taught me more than you realize about strategy and patience. And unlike her, I don't have any sentimental attachment to preserving this family's reputation. I left them sitting in their expensive conference room, surrounded by the ashes of their failed scheme and the ruins of their carefully constructed lies. As I walked through the law firm's elegant hallways toward the elevator, I could hear raised voices behind me, the sound of my parents beginning to panic as they realized that their dutiful, compliant daughter had just declared her independence in the most dramatic way possible. The elevator doors closed behind me, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished steel. The woman looking back at me bore only a superficial resemblance to the person who had walked into that conference room an hour earlier. This woman had fire in her eyes and steel in her spine. This woman was ready for whatever came next. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in years, I felt like I might actually win. The San Francisco fog rolled in thick that evening as I sat in my apartment, surrounded by documents spread across every available surface. Coffee cups marked various stages of the day's progress, from the optimistic morning brew to the desperate late-night espresso that now sat cooling beside my laptop. The confrontation at my parents' office had been satisfying in the moment, but now came the harder work of building an unshakable case against them. Jessica had arrived an hour earlier, with a photographer from the Chronicle and a digital forensics expert named Marcus, who specialized in financial crimes. The three of them worked with quiet efficiency, documenting every piece of evidence I had gathered from Grandma Catherine's hidden files. Flashbulbs illuminated bank statements and insurance documents, while Marcus ran sophisticated software to verify the authenticity of digital records. "This is extraordinary," Jessica murmured as she photographed a particularly damning series of bank transfers. "Your grandmother documented everything with the precision of someone who spent her career in business litigation. These aren't just financial records, they're a roadmap to prosecution." Marcus looked up from his laptop, where he had been analyzing metadata from digital files. "The timestamps on these documents tell a fascinating story. Your grandmother was systematically gathering evidence for months before her death, probably building toward a criminal referral to the district attorney's office." The revelation sent a chill through me. I had known that Grandma Catherine was sharp and methodical, but the scope of her investigation was breathtaking. She hadn't just stumbled across my parents' theft. She had conducted a thorough forensic audit of their activities, tracking money through multiple accounts and shell companies with the skill of a professional investigator. "Look at this," the photographer said, pointing to a series of photographs that showed my parents entering and leaving various banks around the Bay Area. Your grandmother hired a private investigator to document their activities. She has photos of them making cash deposits, meeting with offshore banking representatives, even visiting safe deposit boxes in Marin County. The evidence painted a picture of systematic financial crime that went far beyond simple theft from an elderly relative. My parents had constructed an elaborate network for moving and hiding stolen money, suggesting that Grandma Catherine hadn't been their only victim. The scope of their operation was staggering, and the legal implications would destroy them completely if the information ever became public. Jessica's phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she stepped into my kitchen to answer it. When she returned, her expression was grim with excitement. That was my editor. I gave him a preliminary briefing about what we've uncovered, and he wants to fast-track this story. But he also said something interesting. Apparently, the FBI's white-collar crime unit has been asking questions about several prominent Bay Area law firms, including Chen and Associates. The news hit me like a physical blow. Federal investigators were already circling my parents' firm, which meant that their criminal activities had attracted attention from multiple sources. Grandma Catherine's investigation might have been just one thread in a much larger web of evidence that was slowly tightening around them. Marcus saved his analysis to an encrypted drive and closed his laptop. "I've got enough here to keep their forensic accountants busy for months." The money trail leads through at least 6 different financial institutions and 3 offshore jurisdictions. This isn't amateur hour stuff. Your parents are sophisticated criminals who have been running this operation for years. The word criminals echoed in my mind as I stared at the evidence scattered across my living room. These weren't just ethical lapses or questionable business practices. My parents were career thieves who had built their entire lifestyle on money stolen from vulnerable clients, who trusted them with their most important financial decisions. I walked to my window and looked out. Afternoon, my parents would probably be under federal surveillance if they weren't already. Within days or weeks, they would likely be arrested and charged with multiple felonies carrying decades in prison. Their law firm would be shut down, their assets seized, and their reputations destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. After I hung up the phone, the apartment fell silent, except for the distant sound of traffic on the street below. Jessica, Marcus, and the photographer had finished their work and were packing up their equipment, leaving me alone with the magnitude of what I had set in motion. My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Victoria, we need to talk. Come to the house tomorrow morning. There are things you don't understand about your grandmother. And this inheritance. We can work this out as a family." The message was clearly an attempt to lure me into another confrontation where they could threaten and intimidate me into backing down. They probably assumed that burning the fake check had been an empty gesture, that I would eventually cave to their pressure and hand over the real inheritance in exchange for family peace. They had no idea that I had already contacted federal law enforcement, or that their criminal activities were about to be exposed to the world. In their arrogance, they believed they could still control the narrative and manipulate me into compliance through the same tactics that had worked for decades. I typed back a brief response. "I think we've said everything that needs to be said. My lawyers will be in touch if there's anything else to discuss." The reference to lawyers was deliberately vague but ominous, designed to make them wonder whether I had already retained legal representation. By tomorrow, it wouldn't matter what they suspected. The federal investigation would be moving forward with or without their cooperation. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw images from my childhood. Family vacations where my parents had seemed loving and devoted. Holiday celebrations where they had showered me with expensive gifts bought with money stolen from vulnerable clients. Birthday parties held in the elegant home that had been purchased with the proceeds of financial fraud. How long had it been going on? Had they always been criminals? Or had they gradually descended into corruption over the years? I thought about all the times they had lectured me about honesty and integrity, about the importance of ethical behavior and professional responsibility. The hypocrisy was staggering in its scope and shamelessness. But beneath the anger and betrayal, I felt something else. Relief. For the first time in my adult life, I was free from the weight of their expectations and the burden of their approval. I could make decisions based on my own values and judgment, rather than constantly seeking their guidance and validation. The morning arrived gray and overcast, with the kind of persistent drizzle that made San Francisco feel more like London than California. I dressed carefully for my meeting with Agent Morrison, choosing a conservative black suit that would project seriousness and credibility. The documents were organized in a leather briefcase that had been a law school graduation gift from Grandma Catherine. The federal building was an imposing structure of concrete and steel that dominated several city blocks downtown. Security was tight, with metal detectors and armed guards who scrutinized my identification with professional suspicion. Agent Morrison met me in the lobby, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail about the people around her. She led me through a maze of corridors to a small conference room furnished with a metal table and uncomfortable chairs. The walls were bare except for official government notices and a large mirror that I suspected was one-way glass. A digital recorder sat in the center of the table, its red light indicating that our conversation was being preserved for future legal proceedings. Agent Morrison opened a thick folder and spread several photographs across the table. "Do you recognize any of these people?" she asked. The photos showed my parents at various locations around the Bay Area, sometimes alone and sometimes with people I didn't recognize. There were images of them entering banks, meeting with clients, and having dinner at expensive restaurants with individuals who looked like business associates or potential co-conspirators. "That's Harold Whitman," I said, pointing to a man in one of the photographs. "He was at the meeting yesterday where my parents tried to get me to sign trust documents. And that woman beside him is Patricia Valdez, who they introduced as an estate tax specialist." Agent Morrison made notes in the margin of the photograph. "Both Whitman and Valdez are persons of interest in our investigation. The fact that your parents brought them to a meeting about your inheritance suggests that they were planning to involve you in their criminal enterprise." The idea that I had come so close to being made an unwitting accomplice in their crimes sent a chill through me. If I had signed those trust documents, would I have been legally liable for their theft? Would the federal government have considered me a co-conspirator rather than a victim? As I provided copies of Grandma Catherine's evidence and answered Agent Morrison's detailed questions about my parents' activities, I began to understand the true scope of their criminal operation. They hadn't just been stealing from individual clients. They had been running a complex scheme that involved insurance fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation would probably take months to complete, but Agent Morrison assured me that they had enough evidence to move forward immediately. Search warrants were already being prepared for my parents' home, office, and various financial accounts. By the end of the week, their entire world would come crashing down around them. When I left the federal building that afternoon, I felt like a different person than the one who had walked in that morning. I was no longer just Victoria Chen, the dutiful daughter who had discovered her parents' crimes. I was now a federal witness in a major white-collar crime case, someone whose testimony could help bring down a criminal organization that had been operating for years. The real $50 million inheritance was still safely locked away, waiting for me to claim it when the legal proceedings were complete. But more important than the money was the knowledge that I had finally broken free from the web of lies and manipulation that had defined my entire relationship with my parents. Grandma Catherine's final gift hadn't just been financial independence. It had been the courage to see the truth and the strength to act on it, no matter how painful the consequences might be. 3 months later, I stood in the same federal courthouse where my parents had once practiced law, watching as they were led away in handcuffs. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. Richard and Elena Chen, who had spent decades defending white-collar criminals, were now facing 20-year sentences for conspiracy, fraud, and elder abuse. The trial had been swift and merciless. Agent Morrison's team had uncovered a network of victims spanning 15 years, with total losses exceeding $40 million. Harold Whitman had pleaded guilty immediately, hoping for a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony against my parents. Patricia Valdez had fled to Mexico but was extradited within weeks. Jessica's articles had run on the front page of the Chronicle for 6 consecutive days, each revelation more damning than the last. The legal community was in shock. Chen and Associates had been considered one of the most prestigious firms in the city. Now their offices sat empty, windows papered with federal seizure notices. I testified on the 3rd day of the trial, my voice steady as I described the burned check and their attempts to steal my inheritance. When the prosecutor asked about my current relationship with my parents, I looked directly at them for the first time since the trial began. "I don't have parents anymore," I said simply. "I have 2 strangers who share my DNA." My mother's face crumpled at those words, but my father stared straight ahead with the cold expression of someone who blamed everyone but himself for his downfall. Even in defeat, he remained utterly convinced of his own righteousness. The real $50 million had been released to me 2 weeks earlier, after the FBI confirmed its legitimacy. I had immediately donated $5 million to a foundation supporting elderly victims of financial crimes. Grandma Catherine would have approved. With the remaining inheritance, I opened my own law practice specializing in elder law and financial protection. My first case was representing 3 of my parents' former victims in civil suits against the remnants of Chen and Associates. We recovered every penny they had lost, plus damages. Mrs. Patterson had become my unofficial office manager, her teacher's instincts perfectly suited for organizing case files and managing client relationships. She insisted on working for free, claiming it gave her more purpose than 20 years of retirement had provided. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she told me one afternoon, as we reviewed files of cases we'd won. "You've become exactly the woman she knew you could be." I kept Grandma Catherine's final letter framed on my office wall, a daily reminder of the strength that came from choosing truth over comfort, justice over family loyalty. The words that had once seemed impossible now felt like prophecy fulfilled. My parents were sentenced on a gray December morning. 22 years for my father, 18 for my mother. They would be eligible for parole when they were both in their 80s, broken and forgotten. As they were led away, my father turned back one last time. "You destroyed your own family," he called out, his voice echoing in the marble hallway. I smiled the same smile I'd worn while watching their fake check burn. "No," I replied loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saved it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.